And now, the Deeper Thinking Podcast, a space for ideas and reflections in our uncertain times.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking Podcast. In a cultural moment increasingly obsessed with wealth and efficiency, the billionaire has become more than a financial category. He has become a mythic figure. He does not merely manage capital, he performs it. His actions are framed as visionary, his disruptions as revolutionary, his presence in the political sphere as providential rather than problematic. What is being dismantled in this process is not just bureaucracy or inefficiency, but the very concept of shared responsibility. Public services are recast as bloated relics, governance as a barrier, and collective care as weakness. The billionaire reimagines himself as patriot, saviour, architect of renewal. But if this figure is our new civic icon, it's worth asking what he believes he's correcting and who bears the cost of his correction. The vigilante hero archetype, deeply embedded in global cultural narratives, depends on two premises: that the system is broken and that only the exceptional individual can restore justice. Like the cinematic ancestors, Batman, Zorro, even Mad Max, today's ultra-wealthy step into this role when official mechanisms are declared insufficient. But unlike those fictional figures, their tools are not symbolic. They are legislative, bureaucratic, financial. Their power is not granted by narrative crisis, it is granted by structural privilege. And that privilege has not just disrupted the system, it has become the system. Billionaires are no longer anomalies within democracy, they are often its informal operators. This morphing of statecraft into wealthcraft recalls the warnings of Max Weber, who argued that bureaucracies are not neutral. They are shaped by the values and interests of those who control them. In the age of concentrated capital, the state is no longer a framework for collective deliberation. It is increasingly a platform for financial optimization. The myth of the heroic billionaire thrives on the illusion of meritocracy, that extraordinary wealth is evidence of extraordinary vision, discipline, or genius. But the data tells another story. Between 2020 and 2023, the richest 1% claimed almost two-thirds of new global wealth. This is not the consequence of brilliance, it is the logic of extraction. The same billionaires celebrated for philanthropy, Bezos, Zuckerberg, Gates, also top the lists for lowest effective tax rates. Their giving grows only because their hoarding outpaces it. Philanthropy, then, functions not as an antidote to inequality, but as a symptom of it. It offers moral cover for a system that allows wealth to metastasize while billions survive on less than $2 a day. What makes the billionaire myth durable is its effective architecture. These men are not just rich, they are cast as revolutionaries. They are given the script of heroism, even as they undermine the very democratic foundations they claim to rescue. They cast shadows that shine. The question is not whether their giving helps some, it is whether their wealth and their unchecked access to power cripples the possibility of justice for all. This is a moment saturated with paradox. Billionaires who cast themselves as liberators while deepening the very hierarchies they claim to disrupt. They present themselves not merely as stewards of capital, but as moral agents uniquely equipped to redesign society. What gets displaced in this performance is the role of institutions, of public deliberation, of slow democratic process. When billionaires absorb the roles of policymaker, diplomat, educator, and saviour, citizenship itself is deformed, no longer anchored in collective governance, but outsourced to the preferences of private power. The archetype of the lone visionary, once confined to fantasy and fiction, now walks the corridors of actual influence, rewriting public futures with private hands. This is not simply about wealth, it is about legitimacy. Philanthropy becomes a mechanism through which authority is claimed. A billionaire donates billions and is celebrated, even canonized, despite having accumulated that wealth through mechanisms that often erode public infrastructure. Giving in this model is not generosity, it is soft governance. It redraws the borders of care, not through democratic negotiation, but through elite discretion. The result is a kind of moral laundering. Structural violence is cleansed through strategic benevolence. Charity becomes choreography. Applause replaces accountability. Here, Michel Foucault's analysis of power remains prescient. In his account, modern governance is less about coercion and more about normalization, about shaping the conditions under which people live, think, and act. Philanthropy in this light is not a remedy for inequality, but an instrument of it. It doesn't correct the imbalance, it entrenches it through aesthetic appeal. Power no longer appears as domination, but as assistance. The billionaire becomes not just untouchable, but adored. And yet the narrative is fraying. Around the world, there is a rising skepticism, a cultural reappraisal of extreme wealth. The notion that billionaires are simply misunderstood visionaries is being replaced by a more systemic critique. Public trust in ultra-wealthy leaders is eroding. Their companies are scrutinized. Their platforms are challenged. Protest movements and political campaigns are increasingly united by a shared demand that wealth no longer confer impunity. This is not mere resentment, it is recognition that inequality is not incidental but intentional, designed and maintained by the very figures who now claim to fix it. Lauren Berlant might call this the cruel optimism of billionaire hope, the attachment to a fantasy that actively obstructs the conditions of its own fulfillment. We are seduced by the myth, even as it strips away the structures we need to live well. And still, we return to it. Still, we wait. But the waiting is beginning to break. The hero's shape is still there, but now it flickers. The erosion of this myth leaves a question trembling in its place. If not the billionaire, then who? When concentrated wealth ceases to be the vessel of our collective longing, the space it vacates must be filled not with nostalgia, but with deliberate reconstruction. This is the danger of the vacuum, that in the absence of a coherent alternative, new hierarchies emerge, cloaked in different language, but structured by the same exclusions. The logic of salvation by exception is seductive. It offers speed. It flatters. But democracy, if it is to survive, must be defended not with spectacle, but with structure, with frameworks that resist the impulse to centralize power in the hands of the few, no matter how charismatic, intelligent, or well-intentioned they appear. The shift from spectacle to structure begins with reasserting the primacy of the public. When the legal system intervenes to limit the reach of ultra-wealthy influence, it does more than enforce rules. It symbolically reclaims boundaries. It reminds us that citizenship is not a performance, but a responsibility. That policy must not be authored by fortune, and that legitimacy in a functioning democracy is earned through accountability, not applause. Wendy Brown's work on neoliberalism makes this moment legible. In Undoing the Demos, she outlines how democratic institutions have been hollowed out by market rationality, retooling citizens into consumers and the state into a business. The billionaire, under this schema, is not a glitch. He is the algorithm's output. Brown warns that when economic logic infects all domains of life, we forget how to speak in the language of rights, of justice, of care. What remains are metrics, contracts, and charisma. The public is displaced by the proprietary. Still, resistance persists. Movements advocating wealth taxation, corporate accountability, and universal public services mark a new cultural intelligence, one that is no longer captivated by the theatre of benevolence. These movements understand that the future is not built by heroic interventions, but by durable coalitions. They reject the narrative that billionaires are humanity's apex, and instead ask a quieter, more radical question. What does it mean to build a world in which no one is permitted to hoard this much? Governance must return to the many. Authority must be reimagined as reciprocity, not exception. The myth flickers, the crowd exhales, a new tempo begins. To refuse the script is not simply to reject wealth, but to interrogate the conditions that allow it to concentrate so grotesquely. It is to ask how systems have been calibrated not for flourishing but for funneling, how public goods have become private assets, and how democratic language has been gutted and reskinned as corporate speech. In place of justice, we find innovation. In place of rights, impact. In place of solidarity, branding. The billionaire, in this re-engineered civic imagination, is not only a person of influence but a substitute for governance itself. His wealth becomes permission, his platforms become policy, his donations become infrastructure. And in this substitution, the public is rendered decorative. But alternatives do not emerge by default. They must be nurtured. They must be protected from the very logics they seek to replace. This is why critique, while essential, is not enough. What follows the dismantling of myth must be the hard, often unglamorous work of building systems that do not rely on saviours. Systems that embed justice not in the charisma of individuals, but in the architecture of institutions. That means taxation structures that function as tools of redistribution, not punishment. Governance models that are participatory rather than performative. Economies that are designed to generate sufficiency, not scarcity. Here, the framework proposed by Amartya Sen, the capability approach, offers a more humane metric for progress. Rather than evaluating societies by GDP or capital accumulation, Sen suggests we measure the actual freedoms people have to live the lives they value. This reframes justice not as an abstract ideal, but as a concrete distribution of possibility. It locates inequality not just in income, but in the deprivation of agency. And in doing so, it calls into question the legitimacy of a world where one man's wealth could fund planetary healthcare while billions go without clean water. The work, then, is not simply to resist the billionaire's rise, but to reclaim the moral imagination, to craft new stories in which the central figures are not moguls or messiahs, but communities, coalitions, assemblies, people bound not by hierarchy or heroism, but by shared vulnerability and mutual investment. To imagine a future in which power circulates rather than accumulates, in which care is not an afterthought, but the first design principle. The billionaire does not need to be hated, he needs to be made structurally irrelevant. Not because wealth itself is evil, but because democracy cannot survive a world in which power is inherited by liquidity. What is needed now is not just resistance to the old myth, but authorship of the new one. One that begins not with grandeur, but with equity, not with exception, but with relation, not with a hero, but with all of us. And so the question becomes not whether billionaires should be vilified, but whether society can afford the conditions that allow them to exist as they do. Their presence at the helm of governance, culture and economy is not an accident. It is an artifact of a value system that confuses technological prowess with moral clarity, financial success with political legitimacy. The billionaire in the mythic mode is a figure of acceleration, fast solutions, bold bets, the luxury of bypass. But democracy is not a system designed for speed. It is a system designed for deliberation, for contradiction, for repair. The billionaire compresses all of this into the illusion of decisiveness, and in doing so unthreads the patient fabric of public life. What is now needed is not a new elite, but a radical reinvestment in the ordinary, in systems that are slow, imperfect and shared, in infrastructures of care rather than cathedrals of wealth. The story of extreme wealth and those who wield it reveals how far the myth has travelled and how brittle it has become. When markets wobble and protest movements rise, when public trust dissolves and even allies step back, the spectacle begins to fracture. It becomes clear that what was taken for charisma may have been crisis, dressed in innovation's costume. That what was framed as genius might simply be the amplified noise of capital speaking to itself. This cultural noise, this endless mythos of disruption and innovation, finds a sobering counterpart in the work of Achille Mbembe, whose theory of necropolitics describes how power determines who gets to live and who is abandoned. The billionaire economy, for all its surface benevolence, presides over precisely this calculus. Where public services are slashed and governance outsourced, life chances are triaged. What appears as efficiency is often structured disappearance. What looks like progress may be the slow subtraction of the many. But to shift course, belief alone is not enough. There must be frameworks, policies, solidarities. The heroic billionaire cannot be deconstructed unless something more compelling, more equitable, and more durable takes its place. That might look like universal taxation reform or global wealth caps. It might look like citizens' assemblies or reimagined corporate governance models that embed equity into every decision. Whatever the form, the function is shared, to relocate power from the spectacle of the singular to the structure of the many. What this moment offers, then, is not a clean solution, but a reckoning. A time to acknowledge that billionaires are not revolutionaries, but beneficiaries of systems in desperate need of revolution. That their philanthropy is not justice, but a gesture toward what justice might require if it were truly enacted. That their myths persist only as long as we agree to tell them, and that a better story, a harder, slower, fairer story is not only possible, but already being written in rooms, classrooms, protest lines and policy drafts around the world. We do not need another saviour. We need a scaffold, something that distributes weight, not concentrates glory, something built for many hands, something built to last. Until next time.
You've been listening to the Deeper Thinking podcast. Today's episode was narrated by Holly, our digital narrator, who helps bring our ideas to life. For further reading, research and ways to support the podcast, please visit the episode webpage. Thank you for your positive reviews on Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help keep us visible so others can discover and enjoy our content.